Right, yeah, because you know better than I do. Yeah. It's not easy. All right, shall we begin? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this very, very late in the semester event of the International or the Security Research Group, the Center for International Policy Studies. My name is Michael Williams. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce our guest, who is here at the Center for International Policy Studies as a visiting fellow for a couple of weeks. One of, I think it's fair to say, the rising stars, the bright young things from across the Atlantic, coming to us from the Graduate Institute at Geneva, John Austin. John is the lead researcher on something that I think has the most wonderful acronym that I've heard of lately. You must have sat up a long time trying to figure that out. VIPER, I assume at least how I pronounce it. The Violence Prevention Initiative at the Center for Conflict, Peace, Development, and Peace Building. His work spans a wide range of contemporary theoretical, but also very, very, as we will talk about today, I think, concrete, in a literal sense, practical issues to do with contemporary international politics. And he's going to talk to us today about something that intersects with other parts of his work, which have been primarily centered on torture, which is towards an international political ergonomics. Without any further ado, John, take it away. 40 minutes or so?
Yeah, something like that. Okay, thanks very much, Mike, and to everybody involved in organizing this. I'll try and speak loudly because this is ridiculous. Yeah, so today, basically, I'm talking about something which comes from a larger research project that's ongoing and still a bit of a work in progress, which will hopefully become clear as we progress. So yeah, it's still a work in progress, so comments will be very useful. And this is a new version of the presentation, so we'll see how it goes. But really, I want to focus the talk today around two intersecting things. First, the argument I want to put forward essentially centers on what might be termed a kind of positive, affirmative, or maybe just pragmatic reading of the relations between the human, the material, and the technological and politics. And that argument is conceptual mainly, but it's obviously also based on a certain reading of contemporary society and contemporary politics and the state of things at the moment. Secondly, however, the argument I want to make is also targeted at revising our understanding of the place of social science in the world. And in that respect, this argument comes from a particular understanding of social science that views its role as extending far beyond knowledge production and into the idea of creating some form of concrete social change. And some people don't agree with that understanding of social science, and if you don't, you'll disagree with everything I say, so I apologize. But that's where this is coming from a certain understanding that social science is supposed to do something concrete as well as exist just for the sake of knowledge and inquiry. Ultimately, the argument I'll make is a very simple one, but I'll begin it with a story which will hopefully become clear why I'm telling it as we progress. So as Mike said, for some years now I've been working on torture, and in particular for several years I've been speaking to perpetrators of torture, usually Syrian men who in 2011 came face to face with what happened. Revolution, civil war, uprising, whatever you want to call it. And who became to transform in this situation into different types of people. All of them were posted to restive quarters of the country, fighting the now armed rebellion as soldiers, intelligence agents, or guards. And they would sleep like their prisoners in the end in conditions of poverty. They would work in conditions of chaos. This was a real war zone. And they found that everything they thought about themselves was slowly changing. And I was talking to these men, or I have been talking to these men, not with any specific concern for stockpiling particular facts about who abused whom, where the abuse went on, with tracing chains of command, attributing blame, etc. Instead, I was simply wanted to understand how people were making sense of what was happening around them, as they tortured, or in some cases were tortured, and what they did to maintain their own security as a person in that situation. face-to-face, body-to-body at the moment of violence itself. I was seeking a kind of reenactment or reliving of violence in its very practical contours. And what I found when speaking to these men eventually became very important for what I'll talk about today. Let me actually introduce you to a few of their words, which I'll then expand on afterwards. So I'll start with the words of a guy I'm calling Hamoud, who was a soldier fighting with Bashar al-Assad's forces against the insurgency, and described carrying out torture in the immediate aftermath of the in-the-field capture of 3 Syrian army members on several occasions. This is one of the quotes of what he told me. Nobody wants to do this, even when we're angry. It's just something that happens. But why would you want to do it? We were fighting all day, and then we find this guy, this Takfiri idiot, and now we have to take him to a room and see what he knows. It's exhausting, the struggle, the screaming, the shouting, and all for what? Nothing. Normally, they almost always know nothing. And this basic sentiment was repeated by most torturers that I've spoken to, sometimes dismissively, sometimes dismissively, as with Hamoud here, who's kind of performing a certain masculine disregard for the event, and other times with much more obvious signs of being emotionally and psychologically affected. So take Basil, another guy I spoke to, who stated quite simply, no, I never wanted to do this. We got it done quickly. Maybe for them it seemed like a long time, but we did it as fast as possible. We tried not to look, or if we had to look, we forgot as soon as possible. So these words attest to the fact that there's a certain cost, a human cost to becoming a perpetrator of crimes like this. And I won't go into it, but Basil continued explaining this cost at some degree. There was a severe psychological cost. He dreamt, he had nightmares about himself being tortured after torturing. He came to have alcohol problems, etc. That's one of the quotes there, but I won't go through it because it's quite long. So these are a few words then of men who became what we colloquially think of as evil to some degree, who've beaten, bound, scarred, dislocated, and killed other human beings. But when we listen to their own explanations of what happened quite closely, we find that very commonly, the vast majority of cases, they show great unease, distaste, and no desire for what they've done. They say very frequently that torture is just something that happened. In these cases, ordinary conscripts to the army, they were not in most cases ordered to do this. In the majority of cases, there was no order given. It simply happened, even if they didn't want it to. It was something to some degree that they couldn't control. And these words echo quite considerably across borders. You find the same statements from US soldiers, from Canadian soldiers, from North Korean soldiers, British, Korean, Brazilian, and beyond. Most of the people who carry out these acts when they happen, with some exceptions, which I'll come back to later, make clear that there was not really a choice to what they did or what happened, or how it happened. Now, so why did I bring up this story at the start here? What does it have to do with the title or with social change and materiality? Well, of course, this story is a very local one, a very specific, a very situational one. But it's very global, as I just said, in its patterns. And when it comes to politics, as I want to discuss today, global in the simple problem it poses for public or political policy, as well as the very vocation of people who study IR. Torture, quite specifically, is outlawed everywhere, almost without exception. It's also considered morally abhorrent in most places. And in short, basically, there is a very strong formal norm against torture, a legal norm against torture, and a social norm against torture. And very interestingly, this is one that IR scholars in particular have had quite a bit of impact in formulating, in pushing forward, etc. The most obvious case here being the work of Catherine Sickink, largely in Latin America, who, of course, through her scholarly work and work with activists, has pushed this forward in terms of knowledge production, but she's also worked with legislators, with the activists directly themselves, and her work has had very important effects. Her knowledge production has helped produce change in this area. However, and this is the point I want to stress, that change is only partial. In 2014, for example, Amnesty International recorded cases of torture in 141 countries around the world. And according to a fellow group of political scientists who've done a whole quantitative analysis of this, between 1995 and 2005, virtually every nation state on the earth has been accused of torture in one way or another, to varying degrees, etc. So there's a paradox here then. The norm of torture is one of the strongest formally, but also perhaps one of the weakest in practice, no matter where you look, no matter what type of state you're talking about, democratic, autocratic, etc., or the social conditions of the people carrying out these acts. It's something that shouldn't happen according to certain ideational understandings of the world, but happens practically nonetheless. And to me, this paradox demands, as I'll try to say today, that we revise and expand our understanding of how social science might help in making change in certain ways in the world. Traditionally, Sikking's, and including Sikking's work, IR and related fields, have believed that change can mainly be achieved, change by social scientists, essentially, to be very crass about it, by communicating the findings of their knowledge production to different social fields. We talk to leaders, to activists, to corporations and beyond. We talk to other humans very specifically, tell them what we found, and attempt to engage in a degree of consciousness raising in one way or another. Specifically vis-a-vis, the negative actions or the negative consequences of certain actions, or the possibility in some cases of acting in a different, better way, other ways of understanding the world. Again, the problem with this understanding of how social science can make change is reflected in examples like torture, even when new ideas are accepted, even when norms are internalized, even when people don't want to torture or believe it's morally abhorrent. For example, the leader of one of the CIA's black sites in Thailand, I think was where it's first based, Afghanistan, donates monthly to Amnesty International, believes he's a nice guy, etc., but still carries out these acts. More conceptually, however, this problem also crystallizes or has been crystallizing slowly vis-a-vis a certain convergence or emerging consensus around the social scientific literature beyond IR that pushes back against the idea of intentionality, purposefulness, or indeed even consciousness being core to all human action in the world. And there are various different understandings of how this can come about that cross different fields. We have most obviously the Bordosian literature, where they're talking about habits, practices. Pragmatist sociology, they have a similar understanding in some variants in terms of happenings, quite literally. Behavioralism, as we know, has behavioral economics, systems 1, systems 2 thinking, the idea that most of our actions in the world are not reflexive. Cognitive philosophy also has this understanding of beliefs. We can go back to psychoanalysis, and effect theory also has similar understandings of actions or practices which emerge in very unthought or unreflexive ways, and to some degree, these being the majority of practices in the world are enacted in these ways. And this is true whether we're talking about critical theory, inspired versions of effect theory, or behavioral economics. Again, these findings generally stress that merely knowing something, that you could do something differently, or that you should do something differently, is very often not converted then into what you actually do. So with Tristan Garcia, who is a French philosopher, it seems that much of social science is coming to the view that all Eastern and Western wisdom is the illusion that it would be possible to bring what I am in accord with what I know. By some sleight of hand, wisdom attributes a unique and absolute meaning to what I can comprehend of the world in me and to what I am myself in the world. We have always believed that somehow knowing something or having some consciousness of our behavior will, and this is a very modern idea to some degree, will allow us to change our behavior. We believe in the acting human subject as, if not rational, then having some capacity for reflexivity. As he puts it, as he continues, however, Garcia, the consciousness of truth has never alone made something more true. And we know this across history. That we know this in the history of science. That merely knowing something is true is not enough. Something else has to happen to produce something. Other much less appreciated forces are always at work alongside the work of knowledge, consciousness, and argumentation. And again, the gap between theory, practice, knowledge, and practice, particularly in human rights, but in terms of, as we see today, the decline of democratic ideals to some degree, etc., attest to this fact. And this understanding has indeed now come to IR to some degree. This is Vincent Pouliot who makes this point, basically that social scientific knowledge, critical and sharp as it may be, has only limited purchase on social structures of domination. I won't go through the whole thing. And of course, the point here is not to criticize the idea of knowledge production. A social scientific critique of any particular social problem has great value in and of itself. But being solely epistemically based, that critique will only ever have partial leverage to bring about any form of transformation. And if epistemics alone are unable to uphold normative values, then what is required today, I want to suggest, is a reconfiguration and radical retooling of the basis of social scientific practice or intervention. And to get to such a basic retooling, I start in the paper, I don't know if the paper was circulating, I start in the paper by asking what we as students of IR do very basically. What are our own practices? What do we do? And the answer, of course, is very obvious, but bear with me here. Everybody in the social sciences, and to some degree also within a lot of policy communities, writes. Some of people run numbers, they do quantitative analysis, some people go to archives, some people do field work, observe this and that, some people develop models, some people work on theory, etc. Some people talk to policymakers or activists. That's what we typically do. And in the paper, instead, I try to ask, imagining a student of IR, instead of doing those things, standing in a factory at the end of a production line with countless little objects slowly flowing towards her. Or imagine her sitting in a studio before an architect's desk sketching, or sitting in a workshop surrounded by tools, metals, stones, plastics, making things. And I ask us to try and imagine that precisely because it's hard to do at the moment. But this is what, in a moment, I'll come to. I want to suggest that we must start doing collectively, at least some people within the field must start doing. And why am I making this argument then? Well, to understand the importance, for me at least, of moving beyond knowledge production and epistemics for the vocation of IR understood as making social change, it's perhaps most important to compare what we do, which I've just been through, with what some other social scientific fields do. And to do this in the paper, I start with economics mainly. So economics is one of those disciplines that certain people in IR feel jealous of, and generally more the traditional people, because they feel it has sophisticated tools and it's taken seriously and it affects change on the world. Policymakers listen to economists, their tools actually have impact, their knowledge production does something, for better or worse, probably for worse. And generally, people attribute the power of economics to its abstractions, to the way its theories work, to the way it's invested in numbers, and to the social authority that comes with that form of social scientific power. But what I try to suggest is that there's much more involved in that in terms of how economics gets things done. And specifically that economics is a discipline that applies its knowledge materially very concretely. It embeds its formulas, its mathematical work, its data in very concrete material things that go into the world and do things quite specifically. And in the paper, I just give one example. Don't ask me to go into details because I'm not an economist, which is called the Black-Scholes-Merton or BSM pricing model in economics, which is used in stock exchanges and beyond. And the essential point is that the development of this model was technical. It involved formulas, mathematics, etc. And it was intended, this model, to correctly estimate the price of stock options. Prior to the development of this model, traders of options had no reliable scientific method for deciding whether an option was overvalued or undervalued. They had to guess the volatility of the underlying stock price. And this kind of guesswork was often built on acting on a kind of gut feeling, which was deemed something of a virtue among finance. You act on instinct, etc. You don't reflexively think about it. You're not rational about it per se. And those who began using this alternative model were in fact initially ridiculed for not trading properly, for not trading like a man, quite specifically. Of course, however, it quickly became clear that these intuitive approaches introduced huge biases into the process and created crises again and again. So devices like this BSM pricing model were central to removing some of these cognitive, emotional, and group biases, essentially by providing an authoritative material foundation for action. And indeed, what's key about this model is that it was eventually distributed by a company that was set up by these academics themselves, who created computer-generated pricing sheets. And what's fascinating about these material objects in and of themselves was their design. They were designed in a very ergonomic way, which I'll come back to, in which all redundant information was removed. Only the base information was required to create a kind of pocket, easily accessible tool to correctly estimate these options. So it was essentially a combination of the technical qualities of this model, its base epistemic content, the knowledge underlying it, and the design of their dissemination that transformed market behavior for better or worse. Again, whether this is a good change or not is irrelevant to the point here that essentially it was the materiality of the model that gifted it power or assembled its social credibility. Now, the example of economics then, and there are some other examples which I won't have time to go into, shows essentially how knowledge gains considerably greater social authority and power when it's materialized. And of course, we can be much more blunt here. It seems fairly self-evident that much of the power of, say, the natural sciences or physics lies in the fact that that knowledge is eventually translated into bridges or roads or things which essentially prove what it's doing, or prove more precisely the utility or the possibility that whatever the knowledge is, it's doing something concrete, it's performing something in the world. Now, then I take this example and turn back to IR. And of course, the analysis of the material, of the technological, has long been core to IR from its beginnings. But what I want to say is I think it's very clear that there are very few examples of attempts within the field to actively materialize its knowledge in the ways that would be found in economics or related fields. Essentially, we remain with knowledge production and the belief that this will eventually produce social change. And of course, it does to some degree. But this is true specifically across disciplinary divides, I should stress, whether you're talking about critical theory people or policy-relevant, more mainstream people. Both of them agree that essentially knowledge production of very different kinds is the core to the vocation of IR. And I think it's important to stress here that this is not just a social science issue. It's notable within the field of politics itself, formal politics, high politics, etc. But that field is highly archaic in its practices. It's one of the few very technologically mediated forms of social behavior. Parliamentary structures, in some cases, are hundreds of years old. Protocols, etc., are the same way. These things still work in very old ways. The one exception here, which I should bring up now if I have time, is probably in military infrastructure, military technology, etc., in which there are very old examples of serious material delegation of certain knowledge and certain actions. And in the paper here, I bring up Thomas Schelling and his particular work here, which I'll come back to, because Schelling has some very interesting examples here, in which he makes it very clear that the idea of deterrence theory in general cannot rely on ideas. This is the basic point. Problems of trust, knowledge, blah, blah, blah. So his basic point in one of his books is, if we look at why the USSR did not invade Berlin, it wasn't because there were 10,000 soldiers there that they were going to lose. It was because that was a very concrete, credible commitment that was materialized. And his specific words of this is that words rarely do it when you're trying to communicate a credible commitment. But aside from these kind of military examples, world politics and IR remain surprisingly focused on the human in terms of its understanding of how knowledge should be translated into change. And there are a few obvious reasons for why this is the case. The most obvious is, to some degree, we all feel that politics or sociality is core to what it means to be a human being, that these certain procedures are something about the essence of what it means to be human. And you can see this also in sociology and anthropology, where they have a similar kind of reticence towards the idea of moving away or adding something to knowledge production. Because the belief has been, to some degree, that material, or more precisely, the technological, can be dangerous to human social and political being. We know this from discussions of Cambridge Analytica, that scandal with Facebook recently, the place of algorithmic governance in policing, or the role of drones in contemporary warfare. All these phenomena are looked on as developments that risk somehow occluding human control over political and social decision-making. Indeed, to some degree, we've reached a stage where the study of technology is in most cases essentially politically recapitulating Heidegger's view of technology as something that's gaining more and more control over society, leading essentially into a situation where something purely human has been lost, corrupted, or distorted, and in which we cannot necessarily control our lives. The fear essentially is that politics and sociality have been lost to an instrumentalist, functionalist, and so deterministic form of the technological. And this, I think, is core to why there's a certain degree of resistance to the idea of moving beyond knowledge production, of understanding the material basis for decision-making to some degree. I don't want to dwell too much on the theoretical discussions here, except just now to stress that I think these more dystopian visions of the technological seem to me to be emerging these days more because of their thematic focus, particularly in IR, vis-a-vis the military, policing, corporations, capital, etc., as opposed to any theoretical basis or understanding of why this should be the case. The more common theoretical reading in IR at the moment, vis-a-vis the technological, is probably within science and technology studies, which ultimately demands we refuse any distinction between the human and the non-human, the technological and the human, etc. Indeed, from this view, the conditions of possibility for all human thought and action are in fact material technological. To quote briefly Elaine Scarry, it's only when the body is comfortable, when it has ceased to be an obsessive object of perception and concern, that consciousness develops other objects. It's only once the material world is embedded around us that we are able to develop what we call civilization, that we are able at any point to think reflexively, that we are able to have that time to do things. The technological is the condition of possibility for what it means to be human and vice versa. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the technological is not unstable, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. Of course, it is. But it's also something that's simply basic and required that we can't do away with. And it's for this reason, of course, that the material technological is so seductive. It's why we know it draws us in. It's why we know it makes us do things. Quite simply, we need it to carry out certain tasks, even if there are sometimes negative side effects. So from this view, then, the question becomes not whether the technological is good or bad, as obviously it can be both simultaneously, etc., but whether or not the human and technological are somehow in balance in one way or another, in their mutual capacities to produce social action, produce behavior, etc., and then more specifically, where that balance or imbalance is being generated or constructed. And when it comes to politics, and specifically world politics, the answer, of course, here is quite obvious in terms of where what I would call a certain imbalance is being constructed today, in terms of, if we look at algorithmic policing, etc., all these phenomena, essentially in California, in the United States, in the technological industries, which are somehow making incursions into the political through their actions. And I think that this way, in paper, I don't think I put it in this paper, there is some form of colonization of the political through the technological, which is happening irrelevant to people who are supposed to be political actors. And this has occurred, I think, precisely because of that abdication of the material technological from within social sciences like IR, like sociology, and even from within political fields themselves, in which there is a reluctance to engage in this fully. And of course, this colonization can happen unexpectedly or surprisingly, like with Facebook. It can be intrinsic to the system, as with the military-industrial complex. But increasingly, these interventions from outside what would be traditionally called the political sphere are having very direct effects indeed on the future of politics. So I'll give you a direct example. So this is something called Horizon State. Does anybody know what this is? No. So this is essentially a technology of sorts created on the blockchain protocol, so the same thing as Bitcoin, etc. But it's not about money. The point is to create an entirely decentralized voting system in which, for example, once you cast your vote, you can personally verify the vote yourself, that it's been counted, and you can verify the entire tally yourself. And there's some very clever technology underlying this and how it works. And this probably is more likely to be the future of the blockchain technology than cryptocurrency. But this specific technology then is created by these very nice historic changes coming, etc. To quote them specifically, they say the name Horizon State represents our effort to deliver a better tomorrow for people around the world, with Horizon being our collective future. What's interesting about this is a corporation who's doing this, or it's become a corporation. This has become a business to transform politics. These people want to make money out of this, and they want to do it with specific goals in mind. And there are several obvious key issues with what they're doing here. Obviously, the profit motive itself is problematical in terms of distributing this to different countries, and they are trying to sell this largely to sub-Saharan African countries where they have huge problems with democratic trust in terms of trusting your electoral officials. This is still externally controlled, so these people still control the system to some degree. They can still manipulate it in one way or another. there will be inequalities in access in how it works, and manipulation will remain possible. But the entire project remains opaque because it's being run by essentially a private entity that wants to take over, quite literally, the democratic system through the technological. And this, to me, is a very direct example of what I think the dangers of abdicating our concern for the technological risk posing, essentially the privatization of the formalities of politics at one level, and then, of course, other issues in terms of if we go into arms control, if we go into weapons systems, etc. And if this problem is essentially taken seriously, then what I want to argue is that we need to revise our kind of abdication of being involved in the material and technological within the social sciences quite specifically. We need to somehow move away from a post hoc critique of the technological and move towards embracing it much more closely. And I want to say that IR can play a significant role here if it's willing to move away from a solely epistemic vision of its vocation. And one way I suggest to do this is actually by riffing on Mark's book title. Mark has this excellent book called Making Things International, 2 volumes, in fact. So what I want to suggest we do is start making... It's a good Christmas present. Yes, for your IR students. What I want to suggest is we start making international things very concretely speaking. To go back a little, I quite literally mean that some people should get involved in working in factories, in designing things, in working with engineers very concretely. Now, before I get into some of the issues this raises, which I'll come back to the politics of this at the end, I'll give you a very concrete example that brings me back to why I started with torture in the first place. And there are some other examples here, but I won't have time to go through them per se. So how then does torture happen so frequently around the world, if not purposefully, if people don't want to do this, if they're not being ordered to do this? Well, it's complicated, but to start with, you can take a look at this chart, which comes from the British military, actually, and somehow copy-pasted from a US military manual, and essentially follows what it calls the detainee handling chain. I think that's not the name for this one, but it's the same idea, in which they basically trace the point at which at the moment somebody is captured, and then the procedures they go through. So the top in red is the point of apprehension. There's a unit holding area which goes down. It's in orange, a collecting point in yellow, and then spheres, I think, is captured personnel holding facility. So essentially you move from the point at which they're detained by soldiers or military police down to a proper prison staffed by military police, staffed by human rights observers with all the right protocols. And in between you have some middling stages. This is designed generally for war zones where people are being shuffled, quite away. And the basic point here is themselves to categorize risk. So the highest risk being at the point of apprehension, etc., the lowest risk being in the proper military detention facility. Now, the first obvious point is that the reason they recognize that torture is most likely at the point of apprehension, and this is equally true in Syria, I should stress, in which this happens almost always at the point of capture, is the most common form of torture during the Syrian civil war. We have to distinguish here quite clearly between, say, CIA-led torture in the US case, or political prisons in the Syrian case, and torture carried out by conscripts, by military personnel in the field. This always happens most commonly at the point of capture or at lower level holding facilities. And these holding facilities have several different characteristics. First, they suffer from an extreme degree of material poverty in most cases. If you look back at the Abu Ghraib example, the soldiers who committed the acts there were sleeping in the same conditions as the prisoners themselves. Obviously, they weren't detained, but they were sleeping in the same cells, etc. They were surrounded by a war zone. And this creates a huge degree of, well, obviously, material discomfort, but generally also emotional stress, physical stress, and essentially a point of tension, boredom, etc. These are the psychological factors which feed into this. These are chaotic environments which push these things forward. Then there are lots of other factors which lead to the moment of torture, which I won't go into per se, apart from to stress that some of those are technological. If you want to know where a lot of people learn how to torture somebody, it is from Hollywood TV. That's not what's causing them to do it, but there's a reason everybody knows what the term waterboarding is and probably how to do it. It's because we've all seen it on TV. So there's a whole technological mediation thing going on there. So one of the questions the project I'm working on now looks at is how we can intervene in these mechanisms at these points at which violence is most likely. How can we disrupt these mechanisms, etc.? How can we make people stop slipping into violence so they say it just happens, i.e., happens as an unconscious choice of one way or another. And we do this in different ways, including a lot of video analysis of torture. Now you can basically go on YouTube and you can find thousands of clips of torture from around the world and watch it in real time. I don't recommend doing it, but you can do it. We look at these and we look at specific practical circumstances in which violence is more likely to occur specifically. And then we look at past precedents. So there is a reason, for example, that in certain countries, mainly Europe and the US, police brutality is much lower than it used to be. Of course, it still goes on in lots of different ways and has lots of inflections depending on class, race, etc. But there's a reason why, historically, since that 60s or sometime around then, police violence went down hugely in terms of people being detained in police stations. And it had nothing to do with better training, it had nothing to do with better norms or people becoming better, and had everything to do with cameras and recording equipment. Everything to do with this, essentially. And there are different arguments about why this worked, and it's not entirely about the fear of punishment. It's also about the awareness that the camera provides of yourself as being a human being. But I'll come back to that. Now, there's a reason you can't use cameras normally in places like this. In military operations carried out by, say, the US, Britain, Canada, etc., these places at the top, i.e. the point of apprehension, or the middling stages, are generally, like I said, materially in some form of poverty. They don't have stable electricity supplies, they don't have military police, they don't have people to man this equipment. And so according to the ICRC, essentially recording equipment is very rarely used in these situations. Then if you look at domestic policing in, say, the Middle East, also very rarely used in terms of recording in any police station. So I was doing a lot of work in Beirut, and the EU, I think, gave them 20 million, or so. They gave them a lot of money and gave them nice cameras, nice two-way glass, exactly like in a film, etc. And the Lebanese police force said, "Oh, yeah, we don't use it because A, we don't have electricity 3 hours a day, depending on where we are, and B, we don't have any staff anyway. What's the point? We can't use it." So it's just sitting there, nice and there. So essentially, what the part of the project that we're doing now has a very pragmatic, very problem-solving, I'll come back to that, goal in this respect. We're working with an engineering school in Lausanne, the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, to produce a device which essentially fixes these technical problems and these material problems, and will create a device that works like in, say, domestic settings in here, probably. You get arrested, I'm sure everybody kind of wants it to be recording, so you know what the police are doing, to create a device which fixes these problems. Crucially, and I want to stress, the possibility of devices like this and other interventions which I can talk about rest on social scientific knowledge. So although we're talking with engineering schools, the conditions for the possibility of their imagination rest with social scientific intervention. So this is a very early schematic of what essentially we came up with. So allow, essentially based on new battery technologies, new image recognition algorithms, and new solid state storage technologies, you can create a box like this, which like this, which can be bolted essentially into any detention facility anywhere in the world and works without external power and without manned facilities for about 2 years fully autonomously. The idea essentially is to replicate one of the most effective ways in which torture or other forms of abuse were stopped in Europe and the US in a multitude of situations, to create a kind of IKEA flatpack way of doing this. And there are a few other schematics in which we can go through, like the internal schematic, etc. And the key point with this device in general, and this is why I know I haven't mentioned the word ergonomics much yet, is that it's designed very specifically to work with the requirements of military organizations in mind, and specifically with the goal of raising awareness of personnel detaining people, of the fact that they're being watched, and specifically, not that they're going to be punished per se, but raise the fact that they're aware of their own humanity within this situation, of their own human being. And I'll come back to other examples of this later. There's a certain strategic choice in the name here in terms of ergonomics, because I wanted to avoid the whole design theory thing, but I can come back to that later. To end up, or to come to some kind of conclusion, what I want to talk about now is this may all seem slightly odd in the sense that this seems very much just like technical problem solving to some degree, fixing issues in already problematic institutions as opposed to, say, criticizing the military in and of itself or even existing in these places. But there's also a distinctly political and critical aspect to engaging with this kind of work, which I'll now dwell on by way of conclusion. So the idea of material design, even within economics, is widespread and somewhat popular within business communities, organizations, etc. And we all know lots of examples of these kind of attempts to socially alter our lives in different ways, to make people do things, to make sure they wash their hands in toilets, etc. And what I want to stress about many of those interventions is that they're distinct to these in one way or another, or what I'm trying to advocate for here. A lot of those interventions are coercive in the sense they want to force people into certain kind of behaviors, often quite effectively. And there are very good critiques of this process, of this attempt to fill the world with technologies that will fix people's lives, etc. And to some degree, to go back to what I was saying earlier, the problem here is the opposite. In that sense, there is too much material intervention going on, whereas in the political sphere, there is too little, is what I'm trying to argue. Essentially, what I want to argue here is that the reason we need to engage with the technological within IR itself, within social science itself, is to input politics into this, to allow for a social political form of design to emerge that is strongly political. The design field, ergonomics, etc. in particular, are not political fields in and of themselves. The same for the technologists themselves. A lot of these people have good intentions at one way or another, but they're entirely fit within an instrumental understanding of technology, a utopian vision that we can fix everything like this. So what I'm trying to advocate for here is, yes, making things, but also doing so in a distinctly political way by working towards designing interventions that remain politically open. And I want to stress this point quite clearly, that this is not about forcing choice. So if we go back to the example of the box thing, this doesn't stop anything. People can simply step outside the group very easily, particularly in the settings I'm talking about. The same thing if we actually go back to the example of Schelling and his idea of deterrence and materialization. There was never anything stopping the USSR doing what it was doing. All they were doing was putting the knowledge that this is what would happen if you did do this. The choice was always open, and always open quite strongly. And what these interventions do then is return us to a state of reflexivity. That's their essential goal. Return us to that capacity that I started with at the beginning that seems to be somehow lost. If we feel there is an important social issue, it's important people think about it. So the political aspect of this then is about retaining humanity, essentially, retaining the human capacity to think reflexively. And such a view, I think, is vital because with Bruno Latour, then social controversies are not simply a nuisance to be kept at bay, but what allows the social to be established and the various social sciences to contribute to its building. And every aspect of human political and social decision-making to some degree is controversial. And so the ultimate ethical intuition that I'm putting forward here is essentially that it's always troubling when behaviors which are socially controversial emerge non-reflexively. Such practices, if they are to occur, if people really must do them, must in some sense be thought through in their controversial status, rather than emerging through various different factors which push people to act in these non-reflexive ways. So the goal of the interventions I'm putting forward here is essentially quite simple: to make choice possible, to get over the factors which push back against reflexivity. And in this respect, then, the interventions I'm trying to describe are about opening up everyday critical capacities to problematize the ways in which one is acting. And with Foucault, then, what I'm putting forward here is essentially the idea that thought is not what inhibits a certain conduct and gives it meaning, rather it is what allows one to step back from this way of acting or reacting, to present it to oneself as an object of thought, and to question it as to its meaning, its conditions, its goals. So the goal of opening up reflexivity through these kind of socio-technical redesigns is related in one way to returning freedom to the acting human subject in conditions of controversy. To continue with Foucault, the goal is not here to tell others what to do, and so to attempt to coercively shape their political will, but rather to find ways to question over and over again what is postulated as self-evident by helping to disturb people's mental habits, the way they do things, and so to participate specifically in the formation of a political will that is fully conscious in its actions, and so we may continue then fully responsible for the choices it makes. So it's here then that the political idea underlying this must be stressed. It's perfectly possible to imagine very deterministic interventions underlying this, which would be highly problematical, just as ergonomists themselves design chairs to make it impossible to sit in a certain way for health and safety reasons. This is all perfectly possible, but it's already happening. even within IR, there are interesting-ish papers about using neurobiology to work out who's more likely to carry out acts of political violence or who will be a bad leader, etc. Being published within IR itself would be highly deterministic in their consequences, i.e. this person shouldn't be a political leader because they have this gene, X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. And then you have the whole Californian industry, which is already creating certain deterministic interventions into this. I'm not advocating for this. Instead, I'm advocating for engaging people who are interested in creating social change, engaging with the material in order to retain politics, reflexivity, and deliberation. With Mark Hansen to conclude, then, my own view is that the crucial task of the day is reclaiming a distinctly human perspective in the face of material and technological forces that, for so many, suggest the inevitable dawn of a new, radically post-human epoch. Perhaps paradoxically, however, to come to terms with the risk of us being taken over by the technological, we need to engage with the technological more closely, more politically, and more socially than ever before. And such a task cannot, I think, be delegated to others. We cannot just let people like those guys making Horizon State do it themselves. We cannot leave it to California. There is a core role of social sciences to become directly and intimately involved in this. This, of course, is a difficult task and a potentially dangerous task. Once you engage in the creation of objects of any kind, their potential uses always exceed those intentions. The same is true for knowledge creation, of course. The technological will always be unstable and unpredictable. But as I've tried to say earlier, it's also the condition of possibility for our being politically in the world, and we can't neglect that fact. And of course, even getting towards this kind of stage requires a radical shift in the vocation of IR itself. It would mean engaging more closely with fields that seem entirely different to our own, with engineering schools, etc., and not simply telling them to do what, becoming directly involved in these processes. And all this essentially then is about taking risks. And people tend to be quite nervous about some of them for very good critical reasons. But I think, to conclude then, that this is something we not only could do, but that we are somehow compelled to do at this point in history. Thank you.
Questions, comments, challenges? Who wants to go out and build a box? Yeah.
Thanks, it was an interesting talk. I just have a very basic question, I guess, which is, I wonder if in all of this, the discussion of the relationship between theory and practice, the notion of empiricism, reflexivity, the idea that people will become involved in the production of new objects, where Marxism and critical theory sits.
Sorry,
Marxism and critical theory, where does that sit in relation to any material that you talked about? Because they've engaged with these topics in quite a lot for a sustained period of time. We're talking about political strategy, or we're talking about Andrew Huber's work on the critical theory of technology. And so I was just wondering, how does what you're talking about sit in relationship to those other traditions?
Are we connected? Or are we...
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So they have another version of this paper where I essentially, so I have a very conservative version of this paper and a much more critical version of this paper for different pragmatic reasons related to what I had to write for the people I work for. But the more critical version actually starts with Che Guevara and his kind of technological understanding or revolutionary understanding, and a kind of revolutionary theory through co-option and through the co-option of the technological, which is very core to these kind of historically materialist understandings of the technological, that you essentially, people tend to say it's a utopian view, in the Marxist sense, that it's very much, the technological will liberate man, everything will be fine if we can eventually get to that point in which, etc., our alienation from labor, etc., is fixed, blah, blah, blah. But there's also a very pragmatic aspect to it, in which they are talking directly about the co-option of material objects for different reasons. They go back, the obvious ones are, printing press, journalism, etc. In Guevara's sense, it's very interesting in terms of the use of guns, the stealing of guns from the enemy being the most basic example. But this goes all the way up through his political theory in terms of understanding how you create a kind of revolutionary moment and movement. So it's related to those ideas, but essentially also taking, kind of this basic Marxist point, literally Marxist point, that to some degree the social and the political always lags behind the material conditions of society, that there is always this kind of gap. in which we have to come to terms with shifts in material shifts, etc. And I don't think a lot of that literature has fully come to terms with certain shifts in it. In particular, their current focus on, their long-standing focus on mobilization, social mobilization, organization. There's a lot of work here, particularly in vaguely Marxist SDS literature, on using these kind of interventions from like liberation movement standpoints. How do you mobilize people? Generally focused on communication technologies and how you use communication technologies to mobilize a group of people, to organize them in particular ways, to fix the problem of organization within Marxist theory, etc. I don't think they fully come to terms with some of the social shifts in terms of how innate the technological has become to everyday lives and the problems it poses for that basic issue of non-intentional action, non-purposeful action, in which we're being guided by technologies more than they're guiding us, but somehow because they have that purer vision of social mobilization. So I'm drawing on quite a lot of this stuff, but trying to somehow depart from it to some degree, depart from that specifically somehow still very humanist understanding of what we use, almost instrumentalist understanding of technology, if that makes sense.
Do that for now. Mark.
Thanks, Rob. There's so much stuff here that it's hard to pick and choose my favorite bits to engage with. So, like, I'm just going to go for, I think maybe 3 points or 3 questions. Like, particularly this past few years, it doesn't seem to me that social change is always progressive. You would note that in the Syrian civil war as much as you do in American political culture. So, how then are you able to distinguish between objects and innovations that are going to be good rather than be evil? Like, how do you measure that? How do you what is the normative basis upon which you say this drab box is going to allow us to be more reflexive about torture versus this drab box, which will record torture, which will make it more effective?
Are you giving all 3 questions, or should I respond?
We'll go one at a time.
One at a
One at a time.
Oh, no, that's
No, okay, all right, go all.
so then, like, so the drab box then just seems to be like you engaging actively in the panopticon rather than critiquing from the outside, right? You're just saying, I'm going to make more rooms that are visible to external power. But then, like, that was my warm-up question, right? And so then the more serious question is, you say at the end that what you want is a return to reflexivity, and that you want to, as I understand it, render political choice more open. But then the point of critique that you started with was that the production of knowledge doesn't always lead to change, but it doesn't always fulfill its promise. So it's not clear, like, so that seems super programmatic, saying, like, I want to change, I want it to be specific. But then when at the end point you say, no, I just want it to be open. So if it's open, then, and we admit that all change isn't progressive, then you're not going to, then, like, this doesn't do anything, right? Like, you've been reflexive, or maybe you prompted some reflexivity, but the change isn't any more assured than it would be in the first place.
Okay.
And then, like, the third point is that, like, Latour and the creation versus the dissection of controversies. Like, I think that Latour is philosophically way more conservative than the uses to which you're putting me a little bit. I have Foucault's way safer ground for that.
Okay, thanks.
That was like the sweet dessert, like sort of a aperitif, the main course, and then.
Okay, yeah, Latour is conservative. I mean, he's a French wine family guy. He's conservative. Yeah, so there's more Foucault than Latour, but Latour is kind of useful for some of the controversy points. So yeah, I agree on that point basically. But yeah, I'll do the first 2 together then. So the panopticon point is actually quite interesting. There's that whole literature in surveillance studies on the surveillance stuff in terms of going up and like reversing the panopticon. From my own perspective, the panopticon is a fascinating thing because its connections to torture, which actually goes back to Cuba. So Cuba has one of the only exact Bentham-style prisons that were built around the world. under the fascist government previously to the revolutionary government, and it was never it was used. But when they captured Fidel Castro and his comrades, they put them in there to start with, and then they quickly removed them and put them in a barracks on a small corner and somewhere else. The reason being very simple, that the Panopticon doesn't work as it's supposed to, which is why it was never built, because although, yes, the guards can see the prisoners can see everything the guards are doing in the original model with the bars, etc., which is why it's supposed to be like the school, which is why nobody's ever built a school like that, because it's a terrible idea. So it doesn't work practically. They tortured them in the little room over there somewhere else, precisely because there is a certain power in this reversal of the gaze, which is important. And this, I think, is important to stress. If we're concerned about opaque technologies leading to certain forms of governance controlling us, we need to reverse that gaze. This is the basic point of parliamentary architecture. If you go back to parliamentary studies, there's a reason they eventually introduced, viewing public galleries and press galleries into the Houses of Parliament. And they actually couldn't do it for a while until it burned down, and then they immediately did it. And this kind of reversal of the gaze is, I think, important politically. And again, in this specific case, in terms of watching backwards, I think you can just put it quite simply to everybody here. If you get arrested in some country, you probably want the police being filmed while they're interrogating you. There is a vague kind of sentiment that this would be a good thing to do, but that's an aside. So in terms of the point of return to reflex, I want to return to reflexivity, but the problem with knowledge doesn't always lead to change, etc. This is open, etc. So I agree to some degree. What I think is important to stress, and this gets to the first point in terms of social change not always being progressive, is the problem with any kind of intervention like this is essentially a normative one of who defines what's good, what's bad, etc., which is impossible to say, and then you get into the whole issue of terms of consequences might be bad afterwards. So it's important to avoid some kind of deterministic attempt to force choice onto people. However, this doesn't mean to say that that doing this then doesn't create certain changes in behavior in particular. The Schelling example is probably the best. Actually, the Stanley Kubrick example is the best one, with the doomsday device thing. In the film, where they set up the doomsday device, and, if you're attacked, the machine will just automatically attack back. Dr. Strangelove, sorry, yeah. So, in this example, it's still open. You can still start a nuclear war. You just have full understanding of the information in which to debate it. A lot of the points at the beginning in terms of the sociology, psychology, cognitive philosophy, etc., in terms of non-reflexive behaviors, are, again, about the fact that people would often behave differently if they had the chance to think it through. Not always, but they might behave differently. And so I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that it has to remain open, because otherwise this becomes, fascist. One day or another, you're forcing people to do something. But nonetheless, providing people that chance to think something through is crucially important in situations where people disagree to some degree about what the right or wrong outcome should be. Does that make any sense? You're looking at me highly skeptically.
I'm profoundly skeptical that if you give people more choice, they'll come to the right or better conclusion. It could be that I'm a parent, and so
Yes.
I have a different experience of
But then there's the
giving my 3-year-old several chances to think differently and having no impact.
And just in theoretical terms, it's quite problematic, right? Because then you're suggesting there is one kind of knowledge about the way in which you should work or operate in the world, and if we just had more information, then we get to achieve that.
No.
Kind of way back. And so it takes some of the politics out of those.
I'm not saying.
Mike said this to me when we had a chat the other day, sort of, I feel like we're few enough that we can do this.
Yeah, we can dialogue.
Mike said this the other day, right? Like, just because you show somebody an image of torture or suffering, they might not necessarily not like seeing the torture or suffering. Might not, that's great. Some opponents
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. I'm not saying that there's one way people are going to think about this. That's precisely the point. They may think differently. There's also, from a politically pragmatic point of view, in which these kind of social theories of choice actually are highly problematical for all ethical theory or all moral theory. If people aren't thinking about these things, how do you in any way attribute blame? Arendt is very good on this point, because she has this very complicated understanding of Eichmann, in which she still justifies the fact that he should be tried and should be held to account. But a lot of her theory kind of makes that somehow problematical in terms of how she's talking about it. Because these actions are being taken to some degree unconsciously or in one way or another, however you want to theorize it. At least even if your kid doesn't do the right thing, if you've told them, then you're allowed to be angry with them. So there's also,
And Jonathan, I'd like to give you the opportunity to go away and think about what you said today. And hopefully next time you come back, you'll have a better idea. Now, that is, right, a radically disempowering thing to say to you, right? Like, that's not, like, that in itself, that's me performing that mode of political intervention, right? Like, that's disempowering you by saying, you've done a good job, go away and think about it and come back with a better answer. That,
but nobody's,
I'm delaying you, right? I'm slowing you down, I'm giving you the chance to think better. But what that really does is just disempower you, put me in a position of authority to say that you've come to the wrong conclusion. And so I'm exercising power in delaying you, or, you know, like giving you the chance to think about it again.
well, there's,
Does that make sense?
that makes sense, and I agree with that. But then I would say the basic point in which people behave in certain ways anyway operates through exactly the same procedure. So, I mean, what I'm trying to get at in terms of, you know, the politics of this being, and particularly of technologies, being predefined by corporations, by different governments, are doing that anyway. So the question is, do you just want to let governments do that? Or do you want there to be some kind of political intervention which allows other options to emerge? All of these are going to be power inflected in one way or another. But that's already the case, right? It's not like the soldier in Afghanistan who ends up torturing somebody is not doing that because of a very particular power structure which is putting that in place, that particular course of action. In the US case in particular has a lot to do with the masculinities in the army, the way in which they're trained, the ways in which these things are recapitulated in those places. So I agree with that point, but then the question is, do we just abdicate? Do we just let the other people do this?
Okay,
I'm going to use my privilege here for a second. Can I make this very concrete for myself, at least for a second? In the idea of the drab, the B is a box, isn't it? So it's redundant to call it the drab box, but I'll call it the drab box anyway. Who controls the data? And have you actually explored this practically with various organizations or governments or whatever? There's surely a lot of Mark's parental examination here. Depends on who gets the pictures, right? Or what? Because the pictures can't produce the effect by themselves, right? I mean, it can't just be the fact that I know that it's there if I know that nobody who's ever going to give a damn is going to look at it, right? Could you just talk about that a little bit? To what extent have you explored this, and what issues arise from it?
Well, actually, partially the point is that it does work on its own, and there's loads of psychological studies on this. You know, even having a mirror in the room makes people behave better for some reason. And this seems to be related, if you look in kind of cognitive philosophy, about some kind of perception of the self. So we act in a kind of, when we're inside our heads alone, we act in a very disembodied way, or particularly when we're in group dynamics, those group dynamics become more important. Become very, they force you into a certain tunnel vision, which is then broken once you have the idea of yourself being reflected back on you. The same thing for kids, actually, to some degree. Apparently kids, actually all adults, everybody behaves better when there's like a stuffed animal in the room for some reason. Nobody knows why. And these are very psychological, blunt studies, but they have some kind of consciousness. You know, you do kind of behave differently when there's a mirror there if you're looking at yourself somehow, or you're conscious of the fact that you're there, etc., one way or another. But apart from that, on the specifics of the kind of images, this is where it gets quite complicated in terms of needing to negotiate with different people. So particularly in, domestic policing systems, there's the whole, the optional, the Convention Against Torture has an optional protocol to it. So most people are signed up to the Convention Against Torture, apart from Israel and North Korea, I think. But then there's an optional protocol which allows for monitoring, and in which these kind of things would allow access to different people, and there seems to be some kind of traction on that. Then there's the issue in terms of military environments, in which this would essentially have to be a closed kind of thing, in which the militaries themselves can look at it, because they're not going to prosecute their own people under most circumstances. So in that circumstance, it relies on the idea that this device in itself helps in one way or another, which has to be tested. It may not, God knows. It has to be tested fully, and we're not at that stage yet in terms of testing. But the goal is to kind of fit it into as many different parameters as possible. Again, stressing the fact that if the tapes are the issue, people can just leave the room. So that's always an issue. But again, we know from precedent that it works to some degree in domestic policing situations in other countries. So there's kind of a negotiation going on at the moment with people at the ICRC and the Association for the Prevention of Torture in Geneva about what they consider the best use case scenarios for this and the politics of that. as well as lots of complicated things in terms of the human rights relating to surveillance and privacy, which are a separate issue which has to be dealt with somehow.
Great. Mark, sorry, the gentleman at the end, yes, we're bringing your voice in.
I just wondered if your work in theory suggests any ways to deal with the current controversy of sort of controlling fake news or foreign electoral intervention on the internet, hate speech, where each party might define what hate speech is according to their own interests, or is it, as you were suggesting, like control, is it what is needed is simply a very open system, the American system of free speech or whatever, to maximize the debate and to allow for the formation of more progressive political movements.
It's an interesting point. I mean, there's another aspect to this which I didn't talk about, which actually gets away from these kind of concrete technological examples and focuses a lot more on aesthetics and the form in which objects are created. And I would say there's some specific technological issues in terms of the social media, communication, news, etc., fake news, etc. But I think actually there's a very good paper which is coming out to plug our special issue in Security Dialogue from Jeff Huysmans and Claudia Aradao, where they talk about assembling credibility. And they talk about this post-truth era in terms of the issues of how science, in particular, in their case, in one way, has lost its ability to somehow assemble social credibility. And one thing I think is key to that is aesthetics. To a large degree, people assume, and this is also true, you see in certain, say, the center-left in the US, Democrats, etc., or the center-left in France and Europe, they again presume that somehow their way of presenting truth, ideas, rationality has been what's always gained them power, as opposed to it being their own particular aesthetics of presentation in terms of how that's assembled together. Whereas the New Right, or even Islamic militants, or different people who we consider somehow abusing truth, understand the power of creating an aesthetic which creates a sort of central perception which draws people in, which again is highly material in how it's done. And that kind of aesthetic understanding to me is key in terms of transforming politics to some degree to have a different kind of debate. It is somehow more entertaining if you're somebody who doesn't care about politics to watch Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton. There's a basic aesthetics about it which produces a certain kind of political subjectivity within how it works. And that, I think, hasn't yet been reckoned with within these criteria. And that's, to some degree, the other side of the paper looks in terms of, you need to also look at the aesthetics of materialization. And this gets, if you're talking about IR and social science, moving away from writing 20-page papers in a specific way, like the one I wrote for this, which don't have necessarily the same kind of social impact. And the art in general has the best example for this. Different forms of art theory and intervention are much closer towards engaging with audiences beyond their own field. So that's not a direct answer because I don't really know on the technological side, but I think the aesthetics of it somehow gets to this. Aesthetics is about materializing knowledge in a particular way.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation, Jonathan. My name is Peter McKinnon. I'm involved with engineering in our business world. And I have a deep interest in the implications of technology to political systems, especially these days, advent of fake news and so forth. I'm just wondering in regard to that idea of technology and political systems, where your work might be able to contribute to somewhat of an add-on to the question that's asked when I posed it with somewhat of those things. Do you have any comments on that? I also have a couple other things
on the post-truth.
On how your work would fit into the issue of addressing political systems and technology, how political systems can be affected by technology. And the technology, I mean, is like your products that you got in your box.
Yeah. Political systems, quite broadly, there is a lot of interesting work in like future studies in terms of in like governance structures and constitutional arrangements, and kind of on this blockchain idea and different ways in which these could kind of move away from archaic understandings of how political systems work. I'm British. The British system is ridiculous. It's like 600 years old, just nonsense of men in a room. And there's some talk about, I work specifically on bias prevention, so I haven't looked too much into this per se. But I think there's a lot of interesting work here in terms of essentially understanding the interplay between the social and the material. It doesn't have to be technological per se. Allows for a reimagining of political institutions in quite interesting ways. And you see slow developments in that, in terms of devolution in different countries. The parliament in Scotland looks a lot kind of more advanced than the one Westminster, etc. So this isn't a good answer, I know, because I haven't thought it through fully in terms of formal institutions or political things. But I'll be interested actually to hear about your work on that, if you've done anything on that.
Right, we'll be talking about that after. I had a comment actually about blockchain. I'm a great believer in blockchain in principle. However, it doesn't scale. It certainly doesn't scale yet. And just to give those who really said it doesn't scale. Blockchain, just talking about blockchain, not talking about even Bitcoin mining. So blockchain alone this past year has consumed the equivalent electricity of the world's lowest 179 revenue. And that's just among a fraction of it. It hasn't even become really a big commercial thing. So it just doesn't scale. We don't have the amount of electricity to make that happen. Or at least, let's put it the other way, it's computing power. That's another thing. So I just wanted to point that out. Also in regard to your notion, and I think it's I wasn't aware of Horizon. One of the things about blockchain, as you pointed out, is you can go and inspect and see your vote, but so can anybody else. Because the blockchain is in fact an open public ledger. And so it's secure in that sense because what you enter it can't be changed. It's sort of like updating Wikipedia. It's constantly being refined by knowledgeable individuals and there's consensus developed around it. So blockchain has some benefits in a public voting system, but it still has other issues beyond the technical. My final comment is really a question mark, and I'm questioning this with my colleagues, particularly in the business school, less so in engineering. Probably because the engineers are, like you described, providing things that ultimately are right out there in the marketplace. But in the business school, to give you the context, many professors write to other professors that publish sites. And you're somewhat advocating kind of reaching out interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, is the new buzzword. And I'm all for that. But it raises the issue of reward. Academics tend to be important. All of you who are academics tend to be rewarded on the basis of your publications, certain marks, teaching, and so forth. But basically, publications are a big thing. But if you're not publishing in the top journals, but you're actually enlightening a much bigger community about your research and its output, how do you get rewarded? So there's a big conflict in the academic system globally in regard to how to publish. And I just wonder, because you're advocating things outside the box, interdisciplinary, how you might address that issue.
Thank you. So I agree fully on the blockchain stuff is highly, it's speculative to some degree what they're trying to do with it at some level. The Horizon State thing, that's one of the issues with it that they don't really talk about, is essentially because anybody else can check everything. They basically assign a token, which then has to be assigned to a person, and the token is anonymized to some degree. But that still then requires a central authority to distribute the tokens to the name, which then creates essentially less of a problem than before, but still a problem of huge degree of possibility for manipulation, etc. So I agree completely. This is an odd kind of idea. It's an interesting kind of understanding of how things might move in that direction, depending on how the technology progresses. So I agree. The other question is really excellent in terms of reward and writing to other professors, transdisciplinary, etc. It's a complicated question. I mean, I also had kind of a variant on this question too from somebody at another conference, which was actually about the potential negative effects. Even if this kind of stuff gets rewarded, if you kind of create this idea of applying knowledge in one way or another, do you discount knowledge that's only created for knowledge's sake? So that's the other counter-argument which I'm kind of worried about too. This is not about trying to move away from the idea of pure social inquiry for the sake of social inquiry, of just studying something however opaque, obscure, etc. That's the other issue, even if this gets rewarded, that gets devalued, particularly in contemporary university life, which, is about... when I put this idea a while ago to the university there in Geneva to apply for this, they were like, okay, it's good, etc., blah, blah, blah. And then they thought about it for a while, and then they asked if they could apply for a patent if this worked, so they could make money, essentially. So from them, that's the potential reward value, in which they suddenly got excited when they realized there may be a vague speculative chance of making money. But of course, it's hugely problematical then in terms of what happens afterwards, particularly for the social sciences, critical, etc. And then internally, I'm not sure exactly in terms of creating a reward structure for this. I mean, you can still publish on this within different fields. That's one way or another. I mean, the key thing for us in this, in terms of it became in terms of our collaboration with the EPFL people, the school in Switzerland, the engineering school, effectively, there's a very close collaboration in one way or another. They're interested in certain things, and we're interested in the social science thing, and we're directing the social science thing. So somehow there's a division of labor somehow that goes on, but the idea is still being started from the social science school and can still be published within the social science school, etc. So I'm not sure if transdisciplinary is necessarily the right word per se, because I would also be very reluctant to kind of delegate this work to, allow it to become monopolized by, say, engineers, which would always become sometimes problematical. But it's a very interesting point that I didn't think through fully.
Very. Mark, did you want to come back?
Well, sure. I mean, that's provocative. I think like I have two sort of provocations. One is to say that if you want pause, right? If you want reflexivity and space, then it seems to me that the epistemological, that epistemic argument is the best. Because when I say, Jacques, here's you've got a wrong assumption, you've got the wrong facts, you've got the wrong data. That is what causes thought in you as much as a date does, or as much as a camera does, I would argue. You haven't changed your behavior because of the CCTV camera up here, I think, more than you have because I've said you should go away and think about what you've done. But that's one part of it, right? I think you're discounting the understanding of the epistemological part. The second is, you mentioned air transports in, civil aviation in your paper. And I was reminded of a advisory group for aviation security that I was at with the Ministry of Transport just a couple of months ago, where I said, we all agree that risk management doesn't work in this instance. You can't measure the number of successful incidents. You can't measure the number of false positives. You can't tell what diminishes them. You can't tell whether you made a good investment. Like risk management is just like a half in a pit. It gives you a format for explaining things that you are doing by gut or by experience or by negotiation or by politics, but there's no science there. Right? So that's me saying, go back and think about what you've done. This is bad. You need more space for reflection. And they say, oh yeah, we all know that it doesn't work, but we've got to do it. We've got to do it, and we do it every day. And so we've got a system for doing this thing that we know doesn't work. How?
In the aviation industry,
Yeah.
why doesn't it work?
Well, because there's no way of measuring false positives, false negatives, and therefore no way of figuring out what will influence detection rates, screening throughput, anything else.
It's aviation security.
Well, yeah, but it was actually a larger question.
Yeah.
Right? With security management systems, right? With some parts of it, you can sort of ramp up and say, look, we know that if a pilot has more than 3 drinks, then they hit the runway X times rather than 4 times, and so let's all keep the 2 drinks, right? But
you can't measure the false positive, etc. So this is a problem, and in security in particular, is a complex thing because of the politics behind it in general, and because it was so rare that something was going wrong security-wise on an airplane. Anyway, in terms of actual aircraft safety, the evidence, the actual production of the things was of the kind of changes they made to aircraft safety were very, social scientific in how they did it. They watched what they did, blah, blah, blah. And some of the measures were still ad hoc, right? It's something a guessing game to some degree. But the effects, I think, are quite clear. In terms of the safety record of airliners, the effects are quite clear in terms of the improvement of it. That doesn't mean it's not a guessing game. That's why it's also something involved in risk. That the idea is not there's one thing that will fix everything. You see that very clearly in road traffic safety schemes where they try things that makes it worse. They go back, blah, 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 goes backwards and forwards until they find something. Sometimes it's better to have nothing. So this is not about finding the one solution fits all kind of thing and finding some silver bullet that's going to fix it. It's more that it's clear in some cases that these do work, even if we don't know how precisely they work. It's a basic instinct, that something works. You can go back to some degree. If you want an exact theory for how this works, that's not going to come out of this. It's the same thing as, people knew how to make fire before they knew the chemical process underlying it. So I'm not talking about finding some specific solution, if that's what you're getting at.
Darren.
On the overarching framing of the relationship between knowledge and practice again.
Oh, that's fine.
And I wonder if the paper would be stronger in its claims if it pulled back some of the grander kind of framing. And the reason for that is because it strikes me that the paper is about wanting to have a better way of thinking about how IR knowledge production can speak to particular kinds of concrete political issues that might escape the policy. So in that sense, it's a nice, like, updated variant. This is the way we can actually affect kind of policy impacts through the engagement of engineering and technological actors. I really like that. I think that's fantastic. But of course, our knowledge practices, or relationship to knowledge and practice and IR, have a range of facets. Right? My primary job is teaching. I'm a lecturer in international relations. I teach 750 students. That's my job. Right? My job isn't to go and do what you're doing, which is to reconfigure that problem. So I just wondered in that sense, if we can acknowledge a little more plurality of different ways in which knowledge and practice engage with each other, to make the claim a little bit more specific, and then in the process, more complex.
No, I agree with that, and I didn't answer your question on that too either. I'm not trying to downplay epistemics, although obviously I framed it the wrong way that makes it sound like that. That's not the point at all. Both are equally important one way or another, and I'm not trying to force. So the job is to teach people. My job is to teach people too at some point. I'm in an unusual place in Geneva where there's lots of weird stuff happening in different places. So this is, again, is not about trying to make an absolutist argument in one way or another. So you're right, I need to tone that down a little bit to make it clear that the point is all of this is actually vital to the basic understanding of IR and what it means, every aspect of it. I mean, for me, some of these, it's bizarre because I never wanted to make a box, but I started off reading, my PhD thesis is like Deleuze, Whitehead, Latour, and all these random people, and now I'm doing this, so it's a bit cognitive dissonance going on. But the basic point, it starts from things like that anyway, that you have different ways in which knowledge is great. So I agree completely.
Yes, your radiation comment is a bit of a thought that I would like to share. And it ties into both aviation, technical and human, as well as the world at large and human needs and the things you've been talking about. And I don't think of this as being simplistic, but it's the idea of a checklist. I mean, in a pilot and co-pilot, they sit there on a commercial flight, every flight, let's say they find 3 stops, but they always repeat the checklist. And it's a mandatory thing, it's been proven over and again. It's built to provide safety. And, for humans in particular, and of course, so I'm just thinking that, checklists could have a significant value in many other areas. I was in a conversation yesterday over a legal case. And it was very clear that had there been a checklist of some sort, the mix-up that happened wouldn't have happened. There were multiple lawyers involved in different cities, and things got screwed up. But if there's been a constant, common checklist, well thought out criteria, problem wouldn't be good. So I'm just thinking how that might be a thought to embed in some of the areas you work.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's lots of, do you want to add?
Checklists are fine, but sometimes items are missing on the checklist, and what should happen. The latest in the aviation was a change by Boeing in the computer, and therefore a certain maneuver that was on the checklist was no longer applicable. And Boeing did not inform pilots or airline companies about this modification. So there goes the checklist. The one thing that everything comes from leadership. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and all of that era and the waterboarding, it came from the leadership at the time that clearly identified an enemy. And all measures were allowed. would there be a box or no box? In fact, they were filming each other. But as I wonder also what happens with the box requirement, what, who looks at what's in the box? Does it truly offer a time to reflect? We say pragmatically, just the fact that maybe you look at yourself doing these bad things, it will be a deterrent. Okay, let's try it, but still, the leadership to get the box in the first place, okay, let alone give you an occasion to look at yourself doing torture. I've been taking the place of the father, and I understand your point, like you're depriving your child, or frankly, that's what educating is, okay? And what if the line is over here, you trespass the line, now please go and reflect on, and next time you'll know where the line is. And don't shy from
John, I will give you the last word.
Okay, yeah,
Did you want to talk about leadership a little bit and how this impacts on that?
yeah, the leadership thing is an interesting point, and it gets very complicated once you look into it kind of empirically, because there's huge controversies around Abu Ghraib, torture, US, torture, CIA torture, etc., which tends to make people focus quite a lot on the high politics of it, which is important. But I mean, you have to some degree, actually, you have to make a distinction between, say, CIA-led torture. We're talking maximum, as we know, about 200 people were in detention facilities run by the CIA, and not even all of them we think were tortured. We don't know, it's the CIA, but not that many comparatively. Then if you're looking at, take away Abu Ghraib, even you're talking about thousands and thousands of allegations against US troops, British troops, other troops in Afghanistan and Iraq that had nothing to do with a specific hierarchical leadership structure per se. Of course, there was the political culture in terms of defining an enemy, which creates a certain issue in general. But that anyway has been going on much longer in the US in terms of the Middle East and Arab communities, etc. I'm not saying that's not important. That creates a certain psychological situation, but that's not actually, once you look at it very closely, torture. Just because somebody's an enemy, that doesn't fix the problem of how you're going to torture them in any way. And you see this in studies of the military, First World War, when they were trying to get people to kill the Germans, the bad Germans, etc. Or even in the 80s, the Israelis trying to get their soldiers to kill the Lebanese. Most people shoot to miss their guns. Most trained soldiers who are basically trained always shot their guns and missed deliberately because they didn't want to kill someone, even a very dehumanized enemy. Talking about Hezbollah for the Israelis or the Germans in World War I. So they had to drill them, train them into doing this very practically, to do it, to make it unthought, automatic. Otherwise, people find it very difficult, apart from a very small subsection of people who apparently don't have this psychological resistance to killing. Torture is even worse for this because it is a much more physically intimate form of violence. But there always has to be something else which goes into it. So the leadership is very important, but the leadership will always go up and down, right, in terms of how it works. The question we're talking about is to kind of go around that kind of issue to some degree and find alternative ways of looking at it. So I agree it's very important, but to some degree it's easy to be seduced by the idea that if we fix leadership, this is going to fix the problem, which is not necessarily true in terms of how it matters. Leadership is something that has to be fixed, but so do other things. Just because you have nice leaders, it's not the solution. Checklists are interesting, actually. They go both ways. They can be very useful and they can be problematical. And the stuff we're doing now, which extends beyond torture to targeting of civilians, civilian deaths in war, interviewing US soldiers, they have a checklist for rules of engagement. Basically, it's a mental checklist, but it's that, basically, which you have to, if there's somebody coming towards you, you think they're a threat, first you have to shout at them to stop. Then you have to shoot over their head. Then you have to shoot their leg. Then you can kill them. Now, the people I've been talking to, the most common game among certain personnel is how quickly can you go through this procedure? How quickly can you kill somebody legally? And you get it down to about 3 seconds or something. 4 seconds is a good time in which you do it. You know, you shout, shoot, down, up, kill them, and you follow the checklist. And so there's an issue in which sometimes the checklist doesn't meet the physical circumstances. Even in aviation safety, the checklist is a problem if there's a problem that the checklist doesn't know.
You combine the two technologies and have stuffies and stuffed animals with cameras in them, then that solves the problem. People are less likely and they're caught there.
On the note of stuff down.
One of the benefits of the checklist, though, is common in your comment as well on Boeing, is that the fact that the checklist is there, it's a global tool. Everybody's got it. And if there's a problem, you can update the global tool once the problem is identified and a solution is prescribed. So I think it actually shortens the cycle of delay in getting the correction into a large body of global users or whatever the audience is called.
From my perspective, I'd like to thank everybody. We may live in a post-truth age, but we definitely